Romeo and Juliet. Two noble Verona families, the Montagues and Capulets, have an ancient grudge that has lately escalated. A pair of star-crossed lovers from the two families will resolve the conflict by taking their own lives. Capulet and Montague servants get into a scuffle, and Tybalt, a Capulet, threatens to kill Benvolio, a Montague. When Prince Aeschylus sees the brawl, he warns the two families that Capulet and Montague will forfeit their lives if they keep stirring up conflict in Verona. Later, Benvolio gets Romeo, who's been tearful and withdrawn, to admit that he's suffering from heartbreak over a woman who doesn't reciprocate his love. Benvolio promises to help Romeo. Capulet and Montague agree to a truce. Meanwhile, Capulet denies Paris's request to marry Juliet, but agrees to consider it if Paris doesn't meet another woman at Capulet's feast tonight. Capulet's servant Peter chats with Romeo and Benvolio and invites them without realizing they're Montagues. Even though Romeo's love, Rosalind, will be at the party, Benvolio urges Romeo to attend and seek a new love interest there. Romeo reluctantly agrees. At the Capulets, Lady Capulet and the nurse discuss marriage with Juliet. Juliet is uncertain about the subject, but she agrees to check out Paris at tonight's feast and see if she likes him. Romeo, Mercutio, and Benvolio arrive at the Capulets' feast, wearing party masks. Despite his friend's encouragement, Romeo is depressed and reluctant to enter. He reveals that part of his hesitation is fear. He had a foreboding dream last night. Mercutio says he dreamed last night, too, and launches into a risque speech about Queen Mab, a fairy that visits people in their sleep. Eventually, though he still fears the party will lead to his death, Romeo agrees to enter the feast. At the feast, Capulet greets his guests, including the masked Romeo and his friends. Romeo sees Juliet from a distance and is struck by her beauty. Tybalt identifies Romeo and wants to kill him, but Capulet stops him, not wanting to break the truce. Meanwhile, Romeo approaches Juliet. They hold hands, kiss, and exchange romantic banter. Later, each learns the other's identity, and both are distressed that they've fallen in love with an enemy of their family. The chorus says that Romeo no longer loves Rosalind, he now loves Juliet. However, since the two of them are meant to be enemies, their prospects don't look good. Yet the chorus tells the audience that a blend of passion and opportunity will let Romeo and Juliet enjoy their new love. When it's time to leave the Capulets, Romeo hides from Benvolio and Mercutio, not wanting to go. Mercutio tries to draw Romeo out with suggestive remarks about Rosalind, but it doesn't work, and finally he and Benvolio give up and exit. Still hiding, Romeo watches Juliet on her balcony. Juliet laments that Romeo is a Montague but reflects that a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. Romeo speaks up and tells her that renouncing his name, or even being killed by the Capulets, would be worth it for her sake. While they are vowing their love to one another, Juliet's nurse summons her. Romeo promises to send a message tomorrow, and Juliet promises to reply with plans to marry him. Romeo decides to ask Friar Lawrence for advice about their wedding. Romeo finds Friar Lawrence at the monastery. Friar Lawrence is shocked to see Romeo so early in the morning and wonders if he was with Rosalind, but Romeo clarifies that he's now in love with Juliet and wants the friar to quickly marry them in secret. The friar worries that Romeo is being too hasty, but he muses that their union could bring peace between the Montagues and Capulets. He agrees to help. Benvolio and Mercutio speculate that Tybalt has challenged Romeo to a duel. When Romeo appears, they exchange provocative jokes about Romeo ditching them for a woman last night, and his friends are surprised at his good mood. Then Juliet's nurse talks to Romeo privately, and he tells her that Friar Lawrence will marry him and Juliet that afternoon. He'll send the nurse a rope ladder so he can reach Juliet's room that night. When the nurse returns to the Capulets, Juliet begs her for news. The nurse grumbles about Juliet's prodding and finally reveals that Juliet should rush to Friar Lawrence's chamber on the pretext of going to confession, and the friar will marry her and Romeo there. Juliet eagerly departs. Waiting in his cell, Friar Lawrence cautions Romeo about the risks of excessive love. When Juliet arrives and hugs Romeo, the friar muses in an aside that this passion might be too fleeting to last. Still, he urges the happy couple to proceed with their marriage vows. Benvolio and Mercutio encounter Tybalt, Petruchio, and other Capulets walking through Verona. Tybalt challenges Mercutio and then taunts Romeo when he shows up. Romeo tries to defuse Tybalt and Mercutio's fight, but Tybalt fatally stabs Mercutio. Later, Romeo kills Tybalt. When Prince Aeschylus hears what happened, he decides to exile Romeo for the killing instead of executing him. In her room, Juliet waits longingly to consummate her marriage with Romeo that night. When the nurse arrives with Romeo's rope ladder, Juliet learns of her cousin Tybalt's death. Though conflicted, she grieves Romeo's banishment above all. The nurse promises to quickly fetch Romeo for Juliet. Romeo visits Friar Lawrence and is distressed to learn of his impending exile, which he regards as no better than death. He weeps, refusing the friar's words of comfort. After the nurse comes with Juliet's message, the friar exhorts Romeo to behave like a grown man, console Juliet tonight, and then flee to Mantua for the time being. Romeo agrees and bids the friar goodbye. Back at the Capulet estate, the Capulet parents assure Paris that, despite the upheaval surrounding Tybalt's death, they are confident that Juliet will obey them by marrying Paris on Thursday. Following their wedding night, Romeo and Juliet bid each other an emotional farewell. Juliet feels foreboding, but Romeo promises to see her again soon. After Romeo leaves, Lady Capulet tells Juliet that Romeo is going to be poisoned for killing Tybalt, and Juliet pretends to be glad. Lady Capulet also reveals that Juliet is to marry Paris, news Juliet desperately resists despite her parents' anger. Juliet decides to visit Friar Lawrence for advice, and if he can't help, she will take her own life. Juliet finds Paris visiting Friar Lawrence and coldly sends him away. When she threatens suicide, the friar agrees to help her reunite with Romeo at great risk. She must pretend to agree to marry Paris, then drink a potion that will make her appear dead for almost 2 days. The friar will tell Romeo what's happening so that Romeo can retrieve Juliet from the Capulet crypt and escape with her to Mantua. Juliet eagerly agrees to the plan. The Capulet household is busy with wedding preparations. Juliet returns, begs her father's forgiveness, and humbly promises to marry Paris after all. Capulet then insists on moving up the wedding. Juliet asks her mother and nurse for privacy overnight so she can prepare for her marriage to Paris. Alone, she frets about the risks of the plan she made with Friar Lawrence, but she goes through with drinking the potion and collapses on her bed. The next morning, the Capulet home bustles with activity. When Paris arrives, Capulet sends the nurse to wake Juliet. At first, the nurse scolds Juliet for oversleeping, but when Juliet doesn't stir, she cries for help. Lady Capulet, and the nurse, soon joined by Paris, believe Juliet is dead and grieve loudly. Friar Lawrence tries to comfort the family and encourages them to prepare Juliet's body for burial. In Mantua, Romeo wakes up from a happy dream, only to hear his servant Balthasar's news that Juliet is dead and buried in the Capulet crypt. Romeo immediately races off to Verona, determined to lie next to Juliet that night. He buys a powerful poison from an apothecary, planning to use it on himself. Friar Lawrence had sent his friend Friar John to Mantua to tell Romeo Juliet's plan, but it turns out that John was quarantined and couldn't go, so Romeo still doesn't know what's really happened. Lawrence makes a new plan to break Juliet out of the crypt, hide her, and contact Romeo again. Paris confronts Romeo outside the Capulet crypt and Romeo kills him. Then, inside the crypt, Romeo admires and kisses Juliet one last time, drinks the poison, and dies. Friar Lawrence finds Romeo's and Paris's bodies, and at this point, Juliet wakes up. When she learns what's happened, she refuses to leave with the friar, stabs herself with Romeo's dagger, and dies. Shortly after, Prince Escalus, the Montagues, and the Capulets show up at the tomb, and Friar Lawrence comes forward to explain what's happened. Montague and Capulet sorrowfully make peace, each promising to honor the other's child with a golden statue. Prince Escalus concludes there's no story as sad as Romeo and Juliet's.